Okay, well, thank you all for coming. This is the first of 6 meetings um, about Olson's impact. That was the title that you gave me. So I decided to create a course where we would read and discuss not only Olson, but those poets who kind of knew him and learned from him, or took his ideas in different directions and furthered them, or reinvented them, or challenged them. So that's what's going to happen. We'll start with Olson himself today and get really into the weeds, I think, of his of several different relationships that ended up kind of impacting or defining what he would go on to write. And we'll go up to 1950. So this is going to be young Olson and getting him to the point where he writes projective verse and the beginning of the Maximus poems. Now, next Saturday, we'll do Black Mountain College. And so we'll get into I'd like to get into some of the figures who have been overlooked. Like Hilda Morley, for instance, is a favorite of mine. We'll also talk about Joel Oppenheimer, Jonathan Williams, and we'll spend a lot of next week on Ed Dorn. And then following that, poets who published in Origin and Black Mountain Review, like Denise Levertov, Paul Blackburn, Larry Eigner. After that, we'll also discuss poets of I guess you could call it the occult school of Boston, as it's been called. So Edward Marshall, John Wieners, and obviously Stephen Jonas. And also the San Francisco group that comes to Boston but then goes back to San Francisco. So Robin Blazer, Jack Spicer, and as well as the Canadian poets in Vancouver, like Frank Davy and Fred Waugh and so on at the Tisch magazine. And then the British poets of the 1960s and 70s, like Alan Fisher, as well as newer people like Robert Hampson and Riddell Olson. So we're going to go from Olson's childhood to basically today over the course of the 6 weeks. And as well as ethnopoetics, Nathaniel Mackey, Susan Howe, and so on, who are all fantastic and very important, I feel, for furthering and challenging Olson's ideas. So that was a big laundry list. But let's get to just an early poem of Olson's that was the first one that Budrick felt was a mature poem. I'll keep one maybe and pass the rest around. And there are 2 things here. I want to, in the course of today, talk about the difference between syntax and parataxis. And this poem is a beautiful poem. It's a strong poem. He wrote it when he was about 29 or 30 years old. And it's an excellent poem of syntax. And this predates, oh, thank you very much. It predates Olson's deep engagement with the paratactical poetics of Ezra Pound, which is, we'll get into that. But this is one which is set in Gloucester, and you can see from an early point that Gloucester really is a motivating factor in him writing poetry well before the Maximus poems. Anybody willing to volunteer to read it aloud?
Sure, I'll read it.
Okay, Henry, thank you.
Between the river and the sea, Anaswan and Atlantic boundaries, the moors of doubt and self-mistrust maintaining a perilous structure of land against the flood. Over all the gulls, white, hungry, gray, insisting in flight or rest, their toughness. He, restless, wingless, hungry for more than ravage, food, or flight. Today the waters, sea, sky, river, overwhelm the fragile land. Moons, swollen tides. A Hercules force him upward. Antaeus, torn from the ground. How? Down? What wings to descend? Where warm and tender earth, when gull to be? Between the creek and sea,
Mm-hmm.
the moor.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful poem, yeah.
Gorgeous.
The, the moors of doubt and self-mistrust caught between the creek and the sea, right? He's got to make a big decision in his life as to where he's going to go. In 1940, he, I believe, was still a graduate student at Harvard, and he had to make a decision whether or not to stay there and what to do with his life.
So this is 1940?
1940, yeah. So he was 29 or 30 years old. We don't know the exact date this was written, but we know the year.
It's beautiful.
It is. So I just want that poem to kind of hang over the 2 hours that we're here. And so we're going to do biography, not exhaustively, but we're going to hit a few major points as to mentors in his life and their effect. And we're going to get into all kinds of things that I'm not a proselytizer of necessarily these ideas. We're going to be approaching it kind of academically. And so let's start. He was born in 1910, as many of you know, in Worcester. His father was a Swedish immigrant who came to this country as a child, and his mother was the daughter of Irish immigrants. And I know Tom Clark makes a lot of kind of Olson's kind of humble background, but for the time period, he grew up, I'd say, in the middle class, but in the lower rung of the middle class. So his father was a letter carrier, kind of a unionized letter carrier, and he made enough of an income so that they could live in a triple-decker, which at that time was kind of a modern advance for dense housing. So they were considered airy. They maximized light, and you could contrast that, let's say, with Vincent Farini, who grew up in Lynn in kind of classic tenement housing.
Actually, David.
Yeah.
Have you been to the house on Worcester?
No.
Worcester?
No, I haven't.
When I first went to check out Worcester and Olson,
Mhm.
I was able to find the house, and they were renovating, and I was able to go in.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And it actually reminded me of the tenement housing.
Did you?
Yeah.
It was a triple-decker, though.
It was a
wasn't
triple decker.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was large, like you enter into a living room, and then it goes to a dining room, and then into the kitchen in the back. But yeah, I was struck about how similar. I'm sure maybe the heating was. I don't know if a postman made more than a factory worker.
Yeah, he did. He did. So I mean, from our perspective, yeah. We think about with my own grandfather who grew up on Fort Square and 38 Fort Square, and it was unheated, right? So the only heat came from the stove, right? And you both lived in that after it was renovated, right? I imagine. So we also think of Vincent as living in an immigrant community where there was strong radicalism and politically Italian anarchism, especially the Gallianisti, the most kind of militant, violently inclined of the anarchists at that time. Whereas Olson didn't really have any of that particular kind of experience, and there was enough. He was the only child too, which probably made a difference in whatever comfort they could scrape together to offer him. His parents leased a summer kind of cabin or summer house on Stageford Avenue in Gloucester, kind of all through the 20s and through the 30s until Olson's mother died in 1950. And they actually amplified their income by renting out rooms. It was operated as a boarding house. Olson was an only child, and he did very well in school. He was kind of a good kid, He went to Worcester Classical and graduated toward the top of his class and went to Wesleyan. His father did die young, and that was a major factor in Olson's kind of financial life. And his father died on way to a convention of postal workers. So
like a heart attack? Or?
Yeah, exactly. So he went to Wesleyan and obviously studied Melville there, and then continued on at Wesleyan for a master's degree, also on Melville. And in 1936, there are some major things that happen in his life. So he decides to get a job in Gloucester on a sword fishing vessel, which shows up in the Maximus poems in multiple places. And the second big thing out of three is that he meets Edward Dahlberg. So Olson had had this long kind of relationship with Gloucester, and especially as a summer kid, doing kind of summer stock theater on Rocky Neck. And he had heard, and it's not clear how he heard, but he heard that Edward Dahlberg was staying at 44 Mount Pleasant Avenue, which was the home or summer home of two painters, Teresa Bernstein and William Meyerowitz, who would make extra money renting out rooms. They rented it as a boarding house. So Olson found out that Dahlberg, who was kind of living in New York at that time, was staying at the boarding house. And according to kind of Dahlberg's recollection, which is worth reading aloud, he said, "Two quack painters, and are there any other kind today?" Very Dahlbergian statement. "Used to have Sunday evenings. After singing hymns, they passed out their canvases and expected those who came to purchase them. I could not tolerate these pimps of the arts, and never attended the Sunday evening affairs. On one of those nights, a young man named Charles Olson arrived, and he asked to see me, but I declined, and remained in my room cloistered away from all these fools. It was about 8 or so when he arrived. By midnight, a man knocked at my door and announced the man was still waiting to see me." So that's 4 hours, right? Waiting to see me. I felt very ashamed and went downstairs and saw this giant. We talked for 2.5 hours. He was then an adherent of Twain and Melville. He expressed unlimited admiration for my work, then quite barbaric. And as I never knew how to handle people shrewdly, he soon became my friend. So what's interesting about that moment when Olson meets Dahlberg is that Dahlberg had published 3 novels, Bottom Dogs, From Flushing to Calvary, and Those Who Perish. And Dahlberg was part of, let's say, a literary movement that called itself the proletarian literary movement. And the writing drew from the American vernacular. And Dahlberg's novels, you could look at a lot of Depression-era novels, and Dahlberg's are among those novels that attempt kind of most strenuously to be poetic in their descriptions. But Olson's drawn to Dahlberg, and for those novels, the force of the language, the energy of the vernacular, but Dahlberg is in that moment very skeptical of what he had been up to at that point. He had been involved with the Communist Party in the United States, and by the mid-1930s, it became clear to Dahlberg through show trials in the Soviet Union, like the Doctors plot and so on, that something was kind of wrong, and he began to turn his back on kind of everything that Olson was excited about Dahlberg's writing. And the two of them really hit it off. They're only 10 years apart. And Dahlberg was really turned on by Olson's erudition, through Wesleyan, undergrad and grad. And whereas Olson was they're kind of crossing each other in that way, each drawn to something in the other that took them away from where they had been, in a sense. That Olson was drawn to the vernacular, and Dahlberg was increasingly drawn to the mythic, the hieratic, and just to read some of the opening of Bottom Dogs to give you a sense. Everything that Dahlberg wrote was autobiographical, including so all 3 of these novels, as well as the more mythological things, are all autobiographical. And he wrote primarily about his mother too. I think about these big figures of motherhood, both for Olson and Dahlberg. Their mothers were such important kind of figures that they were wrote about extensively, but also ambivalent about. So to talk about his mother, Dahlberg says, she moved from town to town selling hair switches, giving osteopathic treatments, going on again when she felt the place had been played out. In this way, she hoped to save a little money and establish herself in some thriving city. She had taken Laurie with her wherever she went, Laurie being his stand-in kind of figure. When he was 3, she had a shop in Dallas, Texas. She made money there. The cattle ranchers were good spenders. They liked to get a manicure and have a lady hold their hands, and always tipped well. A lot of horses were bred and shipped out of Dallas. The Dallas stockyards attracted all the big horse dealers from Omaha, Kansas City, and Chicago, and there was heavy trading and swapping of mares and thoroughbreds. And it was that kind of language and that kind of attention to the particular American scene that drew Olson to Dahlberg. But then in 1936, in September, Olson enters Harvard as a doctoral student. So he's just met a real writer, like one that's really exciting to him at that time. And yet now he's still progressing with the academic track that he had initiated by going to Wesleyan. So even going into Harvard, he's a bit ambivalent. But at Harvard, he comes under the influence of Frederick Merck in the American Civilization program, which was new at that time. Garrett, did you know Merck? Was Merck still alive in 19? No.
About Dahlberg, you might mention that the H. Lawrence prefaced.
Absolutely.
And Lawrence would remain an important influence on Olson. Absolutely. But he prefaced Bottom Dogs.
Sure. Yeah, this is his preface. So the kind of guiding influence on the American Civilization program, as Olson experienced it, was still Frederick Jackson Turner and the Turner thesis. Did you get the Turner thesis? Was that a part of your sense of American history at the?
Yes, it
Yeah.
was, though I didn't study American history at that time.
Yeah. So the Turner thesis, which Olson also imparts to Edward Dorn in the bibliography of Fred Dorn, is a thesis that the act of colonizing the New World, of settling the West, as it were, the pioneering act, was what, in Turner's thesis, germinated a kind of American liberty or egalitarianism, okay, which is not something we need to accept today. But that was a major, this really overarching kind of attitude towards American history, that through white settlement of the American continent, that we're becoming less European, more egalitarian, also more violent, and there are other aspects to it. But essentially, Turner valorizes the kind of colonizing act, and he's from Wisconsin himself, so he felt that as whites moved further and further west, they were becoming more and more American, less and less European, that they were hashing out what he felt was a more egalitarian American culture. And so Olson's advisor, Frederick Merck, was himself mentored by Turner. And it was through Merck that Olson also imbibes his thesis. Okay. And Merck himself kind of furthers it. So if you want to criticize this thesis easily, you would talk about white supremacy. You would talk about the sense that American whites were somehow destined to colonize the West and to subdue other populations. So Olson's advisor, Merck, himself sought out to kind of challenge the importance of the concept of manifest destiny. And he did so by looking at kind of antebellum Western colonization and saying, well, some senators tried to veto colonization for one reason or another in the West, which was about trying to check if it was a northern senator checking the expansion of slavery to the West, and if it was a southern senator, the opposite. Although Merck, from my perspective, fails to see that actually both sides of this issue were interested in colonizing the West, but it was how to do it. And of course, once the Civil War is over, the West is opened, and colonization is kind of exponential. But this is really important for the Marxist poems. I know I'm kind of getting into the weeds of all this, but what's important about the Marxist poems is, when you grow up here and you read the Marxist poems, you're like, why is he focusing on the 1600s? Why is he focusing on that early time period? Why isn't he talking about an aspect of Gloucester that is more recognizable to me as a person growing up here? And why are we talking about the immigration of Portuguese and Italians and so on, and the industrialized fishing economy? Well, it's because Olson's, at this point, really imbibed Turner and imbibed Merck. And so his focus was, I want to go back to the point in Gloucester's history and in the history of coastal New England when it was a frontier, to see if we can identify origins of American culture in those early colonizations. And so that's why he's always looking for, when did it go wrong, right? That's a big part of the early Maximus poems, at least. When did this culture that he kind of valorized, when did it stop being, in his mind, egalitarian or so on? But, let me see, so Olson then, as you know, drops out of Harvard, although he carries these particular ideas forward and reinvents them and in some ways challenges them. But this idea that the frontier, the pioneer, is of utmost importance as an American archetype, like that absolutely stays with him. So he ends up leaving Harvard and needs to find a job. And so one kind of light moment, I guess, are the letters where he's like looking for work.
So Dave, how long was he at Harvard?
Well, he began in 1936, so he would have been 26, and he left in the early 1940s. So, yeah.
And he read John Keats's letters
Sure.
at Harvard.
Sure. We can talk about it. Bring it up. Yeah.
I just know that he went and read them.
Sure. Is there
The rare, what's it called? What's the rare manuscript library called? Collection at Harvard. It's not the Peabody, is the Stones.
Houghton
Library.
Yeah.
Library. Yeah. Houghton Library. So, and what do you feel Olson took away from the Keats letters?
I think the in Keats's letters, I'm certain of nothing but the wholeness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not.
Absolutely.
I think that's huge.
Right,
That's
well,
in his. That's in
Sure. Yeah. And so, what do you feel about the connection between beauty and truth?
Okay, so like you were talking about why in the Maximus poems he goes back.
Sure.
But I think it's because it's like up to the people who showed up. I mean, like the world can be, I believe, shaped like by your imagination. Mm-hmm. And if you're living here, you can see that it was all an idea. Like there's a Gloucester in England. There's a Swansea, and I've been staying in Swansea, Mass. Yeah. There's a Swansea in back there. Mm-hmm. And so like they project this idea of like how it should be, like here. But I don't think that, I think it's like kind of on a, I mean, he says, I think it's in Maximus poems, like there's no hierarchies, there, you know.
Yeah, we'll
like,
get to that.
How really like it could be anything, and it still can be anything from like you. Mm-hmm. That was like how the first part of Max ends, or that first song, I guess.
Yeah, there's a study on like Olson and Emerson. You could probably do a study on Olson and Swedenborg, right? On that kind of projection, right?
And I think at Harvard too, they were taught. This isn't Call Me Ishmael, I think, but they were like saying that Melville was travelogue, and that was one of the huge things. Like I think Edward like helped him say, okay, we have to stop this. I mean, Melville wasn't considered. Olson at one point proposed something to Harvard, or it could have been Wesleyan, and they said, no, you can't do that. That's not American literature. And I guess that's why.
Why he left?
I don't know why he left, but I know that that's one of the reasons why he did Call Me Ishmael. I don't know where I read that, but you know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, he had to do it his own way. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
And he wasn't getting, the Guggenheim wasn't giving him the dough to go out and do it, so he came up against a dead end.
So, back to the thing about the imagination and like Gloucester from the jump. I mean, if you want to imagine Herman Melville as like not literature or just travelogue, and then Olson goes and says this thing is like he was reading Shakespeare heavily at the time of writing Moby Dick. How could you say that that's not
Yeah. So
literature?
the big Olson's famous act and important act is to reconnect with the Melville descendants, right? Melville's granddaughter, Eleanor Melville Metcalf, who helped locate important things, one of which was Melville's own copy of Shakespeare, right, with annotations. And
We have here in all these books.
right, yeah, I know it's odd to think that anyone could read Melville and see it as a straight travelogue, right?
I don't understand it.
It's so imaginative, right? It's clearly filled with all kinds of very dramatic, even melodramatic characters, and no, I don't see how you could read it as a straight travelogue, right?
So that's all I wanted to say about there's like, you have your imagination and it can be whatever you want. I mean, if you think that, like, all Indians should be dead, then, like, that's the shot and you're going to do that, If you think that people should speak Esperanto or something, like, that's going to be it. But I think Olson knew that it's kind of up to you, maybe, or the people that you're with,
Through your
the
own
polis.
eyes.
Okay, that's all I
Well,
want.
Olson was certainly influenced by the first biography of Melville to stress Melville's greatness, and that's Raymond Weaver's
Sure,
book.
sure.
He was a professor at Columbia, and Olson always gave credit to Weaver compared to later Melville scholars.
Sure.
Nice.
Okay. So, well, we can take a look at, this is interesting, kind of rare little thing. So I think it's important in terms of the mentors in Olson's life to see that Call Me Ishmael is, results, in its final form, results from his engagement with Ezra Pound's form of writing an essay. Whereas this, which is kind of drawn from the depths of the Olson archive,
What is it?
it's called In Adulam's Lair. It's when he was, so when Dahlberg turns on his former mode of writing and starts writing essays that, this is Do These Bones Live? It's a collection of Dahlberg's essays published in 1941. And there's a whole other way of approaching the sentence, in this book than from like Bottom Dogs, right? So let me try to find, and in the two shared a lot about Melville. Obviously, Olson was one who knew most about Melville, but Dahlberg drew from Olson's knowledge and from his own reading to come up with his own essays. But okay, let's just put almost like a randomized kind of essay here. The Cross and the Windmills. And this is how Dahlberg was writing by 1940. Both Christ's and Don Quixote's folly are committed in a deep trance. The crucifixion and the dread of it, quote, my time is not yet come, is a trauma. And Don Quixote's combat with the windmills, those windmills, so like Verhaeren's massive dementia, is done under an enchantment. And there's this whole other way of writing a sentence there from the vernacular kind of energy of Bottom Dogs. There's this almost prophetic voice, attempt to kind of get on top of a subject in a different way. So
About 20 years.
yeah, like, well, this is 2930, and then this is 4041. And so Olson's attempts at pursuing his thoughts on Melville, clearly he couldn't do so within the restrictions of an academic kind of format, right? And so he's trying more kind of creative and open ways of doing it. But this is from like 1939 in Adulam's Lair. And you can see here that he and Dahlberg are clearly on the same page. They're incredibly close at that time with their wives that they meet at that time during the period of that friendship, were themselves connected. And they were very close. And I'll end up reading some of the letters too. But this is how this begins. Infolded lies and truths, errors and beauty is life, and its convolutions are endless. Life is not life, which sees an end to itself. Death ends but my life, it assaults not life itself. Thus death's endless feed on person. Carnivore worm, frantic enemy, man lives as he knows he can, unleaf life, and bear more life. Herman Melville knew a cowardice here. Agonized he was, in the fear his next probe would murder life. Fragile his person, fearful his life. And this is kind of this Book of Ecclesiastes kind of attitude. And you can see from those two short excerpts that Olson is writing, I don't know if it's really under Dahlberg, because it seems like they're kind of coming to this mode of writing a sentence together. But Dahlberg stays there. I mean, you can go into the 1960s up to 1970s, and he's still writing that prophetic mode.
Ezra Pound's like the dedicated at the end of Call Me Ishmael, and then Dahlberg I think is at the beginning, or it's the other way around. I don't know. I think.
Let me see.
So
The conclusion, Pacific Man.
I think that the book, because the book's dedicated to Dahlberg because he helped him.
Right.
And then I think the last part is for Pound.
Here, yeah. So the dedication for the whole book is to Olson's father, and it's in a kind of Swedish English. But there's a particular chapter that's dedicated to Dahlberg. So to get a sense of Dahlberg's personality, I am going to read. So because we got to this issue of the dedication, so Dahlberg flips out about this. Okay, he wants the whole book dedicated to him. He does not want Olson to dedicate the book to his own dead father, right?
Who gave him Moby Dick?
Sure, right. Who got him excited about American history to begin with, right? So, dear Charles, you have written a little book of genius. This I told you in a letter that you have not answered. However, your book, no less than your life and your churlish silence, has been a sore trouble to my heart. Your greatest faults are sloth and untrembling bowels. I rebuked you often for your sluggish spirit until you became dainty and effeminate about your time, until you became a sick, busy American. But now, because I took you unto my identity, gave you my table, and whatever knowledge had come to me from hunger, and all the mortal and perfidious aches, you bequeath the volume to your poor dead father. Your acknowledgment to me has the same bitter obituary taste in my mouth, because you, in the same manner of a perverse Balaam and a dainty and vain Absalom, that you were to your father, right, alive, are now offering to me deceased unto your own character and spirit. Now, to talk about someone's dead father in those terms, and I mean that's clearly, oh my God.
The letter back is.
So you've read all this?
Yeah, I read the letter that Olson writes back.
Yeah, we can get into that.
What are all those references there?
Well, the biblical references,
Biblical
right?
references?
Yeah. Absalom is the son who betrays his father, the king of Israel, and ends up being dies by his hair getting tangled in the branches and so on.
Check that one out.
Okay, so let's go back. Okay, you want to do the next one?
Okay,
My dear Edward Dahlberg, I am damned if I can see by what right you send me the 2 letters I received from you today. If it is under the cloak of friendship, then let me unclothe you and tell you it is not friendship, and you are a man without shame. It goes on, obviously, but it's a strong retort. And do not, above all things, ever again think that I or anyone ever gave and gives you the right to dirty with yourself what birth has meant to me, or death. My father died. This attempt of yours to intrude upon it as an act of grossness of which you cannot comprehend. Cover yourself, signed Charles Olson. But amazingly, that doesn't actually end the relationship. It goes on in that contentious way for.
That doesn't stay that?
It stays like that, yeah.
I really like that what he just said about and that's through the whole thing, and that's why Olson's great, is we're all alive. And we all, like, you're born. You have power when you're born. People die that you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he always, we were talking about this the last time I was here, that he keeps bringing it back to how, like, one's experience is, on an equal...
Sacrosanct.
Yeah, with everything. I think that's great. And he's, so, like, who is he to say?
Right, yeah. So,
But did you say their wives were friends?
there had been,
Yeah.
Constance Wilcox and then Dahlberg's wife. At that time, Dahlberg had a number of wives. But they were, Clark says that they were sisters-in-law themselves.
Yeah.
I assume that's true. And so then, when they had this big falling out in 1950, Dahlberg and Olson, there's also this issue of their wives, and as you know, Olson and Connie broke up. Okay.
Woo!
So let's get into
It's a
some more
great
stuff.
hearing notes. Haven't-
Yeah,
never
really
read
great.
those.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's so much more to kind of get into when we haven't exhausted our time.
That book is so good.
This one, Selected Letters, yeah,
It's so good.
has a good chronology, which is helpful, but also the letters themselves. So let me see. Let's go back to the early 1940s. And also, if you're looking for just a good, real introduction, I think this is actually good. And so, rather than slogging through the biography of Olson, I think that this is a fine book, both biographically and into the themes and methods of Olson as well, and the people he knew. So it also goes into Black Mountain College. And Charles Olson, call him Ishmael, Paul Christensen.
Christensen.
Yeah, it's useful.
Yeah. We're trying to get him up here, but he teaches in Florida now.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he will.
Okay. Okay, so, yeah, it's really 1940 when he leaves, Olson leaves Harvard. And let's see if we can get into just a few. Like Olson, for instance, in 1942, looking for work, applies to join the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner of the CIA.
Yeah. Wild.
And he ultimately finds a job with the Office of War Information, But before we get to that, it'd be interesting to kind of touch upon Dorothy Norman in this magazine Twice a Year.
Nice.
Let me see.
I think he applied for the Rhodes thing too, and you didn't get that.
He applied a lot. It's Guggenheim, obviously successful in some ways. So this is really, I love that you have these.
Yeah.
They're rare, they're delicate,
And that Judith found such a beautiful way to.
they're well
Them.
organized. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah.
So you see, I think that there is Olson's on top. Yeah, Charles Olson, Lear, and Moby Dick. So Dorothy Norman was interesting. Despite the difficult relationship between Olson and Dahlberg, Dahlberg was helpful in introducing Olson to, kind of progressive literature in New York in the 30s. Also art, so like this Alfred Stieglitz kind of circle. And Dorothy Norman, who was a writer, a social campaigner, a philanthropist, an amateur photographer. And she and others produced Twice a Year, which was Olson's first, to my knowledge, his first kind of regular gig in this first kind of publishing within this venue rather than like an academic venue. So there's Rilke translations, Randolph Bourne, who was an anti-war writer and activist, Dreiser about Bourne. It's also republished stuff like Thoreau writing about John Brown, Stieglitz, Italian social realism like Ignazio Silone, E.E. Cummings, Kafka translations, Anais Nin, and so on. And in 1938, it's Olson, Lear, and Moby Dick. Yeah, and you're so delicate,
And that goes into Call Me Ishmael.
Sure.
And he says, this was published in Twice a Year.
Yeah.
Well, that was what he was working on at Harvard, right? That was his thesis.
Yeah, but not in an academic kind of style, right? Not with an academic. Yeah. Yeah, and there are great photographs, like quality photographs of life in Depression era New York.
Wow.
Yeah,
Treasure.
it is, and it's wonderful that you have these.
This place is so. I mean, this is the spot.
Yeah,
I was like thinking it was gonna be at Vincent's house, and
Uh-huh.
I was like, but it should be in the library because then we could just pull
Yeah.
the stuff down.
And we're around Olson's table.
The sawbuck table.
yeah. Okay, Lear and Moby Dick, and this is similar to what Call Me Ishmael is, rather than in Adulam's lair. Right? Okay. And so with Melville, also you're getting the mythic, broadly construed, and the quotidian, and combining the mythic and the everyday is a hallmark of modernism. You talk about James Joyce, for instance, but also if you think about Olson in psychology. Charles Stein has produced a good book, Secret of the Black Chrysanthemum. I don't know if you know that book. It charts Olson's engagement with Jung, but he wasn't always that deep into Jung, and some of the early poems about his parents really Freudian,
Yeah. Interesting.
And you think about just psychology, where psychology was at that time. All these mythic tropes are brought to bear upon family relations. The Oedipal complex being the famous phrase, but so it's Freud and Jung and also Otto Rank, and so Olson, certain of these poems, is kind of combining both that psychological or psychiatric use of myth and kind of modernist literary kind of tradition of myth use. And with Moby Dick, it's I'm trying to find. I feel like I'm gone mad because I can't find like the cetology chapters.
Yeah.
Right? Like not every version of Moby Dick has it. Like they've cut it out sometimes. Sometimes they've been kind of unbowlerized in a way, but
What do you mean, like the sperm section there?
total like well, this now that like these lists of facts, which are nowadays are not considered facts, but at that point were of whales, just whale biology, right? And I went through, and I went probably too quickly, but I went through your copies of Moby Dick here, and I'm like, where's the cetology chapter, But I just wasn't going slowly enough or something. But if you're familiar with it, that Moby Dick, there's there are elements that are drawn from experience of working on a whale vessel. Then there are aspects of the story that are what Umberto Eco calls, texts speaking to other texts, right? So there's Shakespeare, right, is famous. And then there's just biology, then there's science, right? And so Olson draws from Melville in a real way, right? It's not just going to Dahlberg, going to Pound, but really Melville is significant, and Ann Charters has written about that. But it's like the biological aspect, that cetology aspect of it, where you get into the real kind of thicket of science or whatever subject you're focused on. That's a major part of Olson's method, Okay. So, okay. We're going to actually read like all of projected verse if you have the time. And so I do, okay, I'm going to speed up some of this. You've been great last 45 minutes. Okay. So what happens is, and this is, this book is useful in this regard, is that, so Olson's really left Harvard behind him. He's engaged with this literary scene, which is kind of a social justice influenced literary scene in New York with Dorothy Norman and Twice a Year. And he convinces them to send him to Ezra Pound's trial as a correspondent. So, page 108 of Tom Clark, he persuaded Dorothy Norman to assign him to cover the Pound legal proceedings as a twice-a-year correspondent. Turning himself into a journalist was no part of his intent, says Clark. He merely wanted a press credential to get him into the courtroom as a spectator. Okay. And so, I'm sure you generally know about Ezra Pound, but it's good to just kind of cover it, where, I'm sure you've read Pound deeply.
No.
No.
But
Okay.
culture.
Okay. He was a
Tied to culture.
really significant, to put it mildly, factor in the development of Anglo-American modernism. He edited the wasteland into the shape that we have it now. I mean, and cut out actually an extensive section about a Gloucester fishing schooner that I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah, actually, there is this whole sequence of a Gloucester fishing schooner going out and hitting an iceberg, which I think I love it actually. Pounded, yeah, which is possible fishing in Newfoundland and all that. Anyway, so Pound didn't like it and cut it, but more significantly than that, Pound was a major theorist of what would become, Anglo-American modernism, guide to culture, ABC of reading, and it's this paratactical method that Pound really imparts to Olson. So the first poem we read was Syntax, and I'm sure parataxis, right? So parataxis is when you're placing objects or text in relation, but one doesn't flow to the other through a logical process necessarily. Garrett, do you have something to say about parataxis?
Yeah, well, I think you described it accurately. It's placement without a logical or causal connection between objects, so that the mind itself can produce that connection when you read it. It's left to the reader.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so what's important for Pound is the Chinese Logogram. So there was an American, actually from Salem, Massachusetts, Ernest Fenollosa, who was an American scholar of Asian culture, Japanese specifically, but also into Chinese. And he was fascinated by the Chinese logogram. So instead, with the alphabet that we use, each letter is a sign, it signifies a sound. There are also syllabograms, where each sign represents a syllable. And then there are logograms, which each sign represents a word. And the creation of those word signs was of interest to Fenollosa, and he didn't develop his ideas into an academic paper, but there are notes that he left. And Fenollosa's widow presented Pound with these notes, knowing his interest in Chinese. And from that, he developed this theory of kind of parataxis. And I'm familiar with the kind of the logogram, kind of Pound's use of logogram. Or
I seen that book that he did on Confucius.
Sure. Yeah, so he felt like, because when you create a logogram, if you're making a more kind of complex, really not actually, you don't even need it to be a matter of complexity, but there are often signs being combined, or the sign itself there are kind of two objects even in the sign. And so Pound drew from that in developing parataxis. And Olson made great use of parataxis. I mean, so let's just do a poem. So the first one, Purgatory Blind, is a beautiful poem of syntax, I feel. And then The Company of Men is a useful poem of parataxis. So, yeah. Actually, just pass those on.
Was this poem written when Whalen was up here in '57, around that time?
Probably, yeah. It's from '57. And do you have a recording of Whalen?
No, but I know that, Leroy Jones and him and McClure, the three of them were up here around that time.
I've heard the recording.
Oh, there is? Oh,
There's a recording.
there is?
Yeah.
Just in the house?
I've listened to it. Fred Buck showed it to me once.
Oh, okay.
I listened to it once. I don't know where it is now or
Interesting.
whatever.
Well, he must have it. I'll ask him about that. Love to hear it.
There was a lot of static and background noise, and yeah, it wasn't easy to kind of get through it. But I know that a recording exists. I think I actually was loaned. No, I was given a copy, and I shared it with Skylar Hoffman. He never returned it, so you might want to look at it.
Skylar, if you're listening to this, get it back to Dave.
No. Okay. Anybody want to read The Company of Men? Paul, can you read The Company of Men for us?
Try, I guess.
It's a good Gloucester poem. You'll like it.
Company of Men for Phil Whalen for Christmas 1957. 57. Both the company of men, one in front of my eyes bringing in redfish, the other the far-flung East India Company of poets whom I do not even know. Tons of fish again switched to assemble pinholes. I punched the music I want out on rolls of paper to be played on anyone's parlor harmonium. The particles in speech as multiple as those dull repeating patterns of fish. Nature runs to pattern. Man, said Lawrence, cannot afford to repeat. I mean the finances of men who give us a haddock, true numbers of the usableness, how fishermen pay their bills. The cat repeats, but the generosity can come only from those who have fish. In the company of men with jingles in his pocket on Main Street, the South Sea of Oaxaca is a bubble. What blue, John Law, why Campion, kicked a rhyme in the face. Humphreys has resigned knowing the nation will go boom. I mean Phil Whalen, who brings his girl a stalk thrown off a rhododendron in the public park, or my dragger who goes home with a rifle when his wife comes to smell like his aunt who works at a beehive. He whips out his pay and says, "How does this smell?"
Wow. It's a good poem. One of my favorites. Yeah.
Yeah, that is great.
Okay. But this is not syntactically written. It's paratactically written. So Olson, by 57, he closed up Black Mountain College. And we're going to talk about Black Mountain next time. He closed it up. He had moved to Fort Square, 28 Fort Square. And at that time, a lot of Gloucester fishing vessels were bringing in redfish. And in great quantities. I mean, it was a real bulk kind of catch. And I think it's interesting, just when he sometimes with this, Olson will just kind of tease or introduce a subject. The far-flung East India Company of poets, right? The East India Company, are you familiar with historically the East India Company that colonized India and this kind of and had these little outposts like all through kind of the Indian Ocean, Pacific, and so on. But introducing the idea of the East India Company, are also kind of foreshadowing what he gets into, which is these bubbles that existed, these financial bubbles, and runs on banks. And so he's contrasting in this poem the physical act of going out and getting a commodity, getting fish, bringing it back, something that's useful, something that is sustaining. And then, in the company of men with jingles in his pocket on Main Street, so you've gotten then money. Then we leap to the South Sea or Oaxaca is a bubble, right? What blew John Law? John Law, okay, and I had to look up John Law, as you would imagine. John Law was, just, I'll go quickly, John Law was an economist born in Scotland who got really involved kind of with the King of France and setting up a central bank in France and the development of the Louisiana Company. So there had been a lot of little companies in Louisiana, trading posts. He consolidates them, which creates great enthusiasm for the stock of that company. Then merges the Royal Bank of France with this Louisiana Company. And so valuation goes up so high, the bank is printing all this money so that people can buy the stock. But then that money is no longer backed by hard currency. So then when there's a run on the bank, people get suspicious. I want to cash in this stock for hard money. All of a sudden, the whole thing collapses. So that's the background of that. But what's fascinating, and perhaps funny, is then he brings in Campion, right? This English poet Campion, Thomas Campion, who wrote a famous treatise against rhyme. Observations in the art of English poesy against the vulgar custom of rhyming, which argued for a return to ancient Greek and Roman meters of quantity, which is a different thing.
I don't know why, but the jingles in the pocket made me think of that John Wiener's poem where he's saying, "How about a locket and woundsocket?" You know what I'm talking about? It's all rhyme. Yeah,
That was the sort of tour de force of John's.
Yeah. Oh, that reminded me of that, and the rhyming in that.
Sure. So you guys, I guess Olson felt that rhyme was overvalued as a method of writing a poem, similar to the overvaluation of stock for the Louisiana Company. Why Campion kicked rhyme in the face, and then Humphrey. It's actually a typo. It's Humphrey, who was George Humphrey, the Treasury Secretary for Eisenhower. And so, yeah, by this point, Olson is really no longer the New Deal liberal that he had been in his youth. And that happens over a period of time. Him kind of changing politics happens through his relationship with Pound and as well as his relationship with Francis Boldereff, which we may not have time for. Well, anyway, so there's this hope among Republicans that Eisenhower would no longer maintain the budget size that Roosevelt and Truman had maintained. And but he does, and Eisenhower does, and announces his budget was actually a little bit bigger for infrastructure improvements and school funding and so on. And his Treasury Secretary Humphrey, so appalled by this, he says that this is going to cause a depression that will curl your hair. So he come out publicly against Eisenhower, and so Eisenhower asks for his resignation, and he resigns. So Humphrey has resigned knowing the nation will go boom. Is Olson on the other side of those experiences of the 1940s and early 1950s, having bought into a more kind of libertarian economics. And he said, I mean Phil Whalen, who brings his girl a stalk torn off a rhododendron, like go out and get something and present it. Or my dragger who goes home with arete, which is a Greek concept of virtuous competition. When his wife complains he smells like his aunt works for the Dehy, which is the dehydration plant, which used to be right here on East Gloucester.
Wake you up in the middle of the night.
Sure. He whips out his pay and says, how does this smell, right? Right? So that's parataxis. I love that poem because I heard that phrase growing up as a kid, The work smells, but the money doesn't smell, that kind of it. Okay. Well. We can get into, you see, it's already 11, so we can get into Boldereff and those kinds of references like Lawrence Waddell and Joseph Strigowski, or we can kind of go on to... Garrett, we're going to go on to the projective verse, Garrett? You think that would be good?
Whatever you like. I think it's
Well,
fascinating
here
what
it-
you're doing, so.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't
I'd
know.
just like
Yeah.
to say that I think it's great that Dahlberg gave, and I've said this to Henry like 5 times, he gave an autographed copy of Living My Life to Charles Olson. Emma Goldman's Living My
Yeah.
Life.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just gonna take a quick.
Sure. Well,
That would definitely change your mind about things. You reading that?
yeah.
I guess it's at Harvard. I want to find it. I want to see it. I just can't believe that.
Yeah, Dahlberg. I mean, if you go back to like their relationship, Olson mentions that he received from Dahlberg I guess a reading syllabus, which includes, radical writers.
I mean, that will change your life. I mean, Living My Life by Emma Goldman.
Yeah, I wonder if we may even have a copy here. I mean, we probably do have a copy here.
Probably.
Take a look at it. But yeah, I mean, Dahlberg had moved from communism to anarchism. And yeah, Olson himself was never a communist, and he was hardly a fellow traveler. He was, for a while, he was like a liberal Democrat, like a Roosevelt kind of liberal Democrat. Although he moves away from that, to say the least.
Well, he certainly was interested in Kropotkin's anarchism.
Sure,
Mutual
yeah.
aid, for example, yeah.
And he has, I think, the Conquest of Bread in there, too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know that Vincent, this triad between Truman, Nelson, Vincent, and Olson, that Olson, Truman was always trying to get Vincent to stop hanging around with Olson
Sure,
because of his politics.
sure.
Wow.
But Vincent was too intrigued with Olson.
Well, we should get Bob DiTilio here, who knew Vincent very well, as you know,
Yeah.
and who remains a historian and practicer of Italian anarchism.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
lives in Boston now, or in Cambridge.
Where? Great.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Boston. Oh, and then the thing about Young,
Yeah.
and because you just brought up the Boldereff,
Yeah.
and he because I believe with his first wife, he kind of went through this whole thing he tried to, through Young, figure out what to do, because I really think he was in love with this woman, and he had this conflict. And then also, I think it's so interesting that the Metcalfs paid, Henry Metcalf paid Young to psychoanalyze Melville.
Really?
By retro
Did you-
reading the text. I mean,
Yes.
are you familiar with this, Garrett?
Did you hear about this? And then the last thing is, at Black Mountain, Olson's letter to Young is so funny, because he's just like, please come to Black Mountain. We'll take care of you. The mountains are great. So, yeah, I don't know. You brought up Young, and
Oh, sure, yeah.
I just know that
Have you read-
he had some... yeah, that book's really good. He had some trouble with his relationship with her, and I think he used Young to kind of get through it.
Okay, we can talk about Boldareff as problematic as she is from my own political perspective, but I don't want that necessarily to color your reading of it. But so she approached Olson having read Call Me Ishmael. She was, named Frances Motes Boldareff. She had moved back to her hometown of in Pennsylvania next to Penn State, so she had access to the Penn State Library. She was a book designer, and had other kind of jobs in like libraries and so on. Anyway, so she writes to Olson, and he finds her incredibly compelling. And so this book, although the first letters are from 47, immediately after Call Me Ishmael was published, most of the letters in this book are only for a 2-year period, 49 and 50. So this was a daily heated correspondence, and Olson kept it as secret from his wife as he could. So Connie left the home to work during the day, and Olson was writing at home and would intercept the mail, get the mail, and make sure that Connie never saw these letters. So this is a huge amount of material.
Wow.
But yeah, Boldareff is fascinating and difficult, and I'll just read a letter from 1950. Charles Dear, a fine human is a complicated affair. Each part of a sentence one writes has so many ancestors, known only to myself. I will jot down most briefly several notations, because I love you, and because I believe that in addition to being useful to one another, we also wish to be known to one another. For my part, anyway, I wish to know about you, and for you to know about me. And then swiftly I hope to come to the part I want to say, which is important. These are little things, just to tell you. On the night I wrote, I was throwing in Christ out of courtesy to my past. She's from a German pietist kind of background. I was not thinking, out of courtesy to my past, man's past, you, etc. When I said I want no brothers, I was not thinking of John Pietro and not even of Olson. I meant in general, for man. I do not want to think of him with brothers. I said on purpose. I could see you smiling, and you low-down dogs stole it from me, quote, hath the advantage. In this case, and how can I prove that I was a great lone bull whale? For that moment I was adrift in the great chaos alone, and I could not entertain the thought of anyone's having a brother, or a savior, or an opposite sex or anything, just alone in the primeval void. This is a very fierce, deep necessity in me, and personally I do not understand it because maybe you have, but I have never known in a woman other than myself such a recurrent, passionate demand for starkness, for the separate, alone, pitted and grim and precisely whole. Maybe there are other women who have it, but I have never known any myself. All the women I ever knew who liked to tramp around in woods and stuff, alone, or spider hunt or that kind of thing, were defaulted somewhere in their sex. It was a minus thing, but mine seems to be without reference. I kept wondering and wondering, how did it ever come about that man invented houses? Who can live in a house? And every night as I lay in my bed, I suffered physical agonies from having the great high 14-foot brick ceilings and walls close down slowly and crush me. And it kept happening night and night. Anyway, that eagle thing in me, which wants no mate, no companion, no babies, no prey, no nothing, just the blue, and motes wheeling the great, slow, grim wheel of beauty, I am sure you have a deep enough soul to imagine what anguish and suffering I have paid because of that need. Whew. Unfortunately, she had a daughter already, so wanting no babies is
Too late.
too late. But yeah, so Olson found this incredibly exciting. And
So do you think
Yeah.
that she's saying that because she really likes him and feels connected to him, and that it's weird that they're so close,
yeah,
but she's been
yeah,
singular, I guess?
I think so. She had several husbands and broke up. Maybe at this point she believes it, and she's saying how exciting it is that for the first time in her life she's found someone that she can really connect to.
Oh, where are they in their relationship? They're like, this is 40 minutes.
Well, I mean, we're actually on page 238.
So
It's heating up.
but they
you know.
still haven't met yet.
It's difficult to really know. I mean, everything was secret, so they have met by 1950.
Do they actually have a consummated affair and everything?
Yes.
Yeah. I also think that she wants Olson at this point to feel as if she's not going to be an encumbrance on him, that she's not going to try to become a wife to him, that their relationship, sexual though it may be, would not be about that. But then there are other letters where this is kind of not the case, where she, as we go on, she realizes that she actually really needs him in her life. Is it, Charles, dearest, I want to tell you that you and I are closer than man and woman have ever been before.
Wow. That's awesome.
I believe I am within your flesh. I believe and know you live by me. You know I give you my life daily, day after day, as it is commanded of me to do. So she was a strong, willed woman, but she also felt that her role, and it kind of goes beyond the concept of a muse, but her role was actually to feed ideas to Olson, who would then realize them in his poems, which she felt was not a subservient position, to actually be the dominant position in the relationship. Anything you want to add, Garrett?
Well, it's interesting that all his life, Olson kept her secret.
All his life,
Even,
wow.
yes, even I was very close to Olson's sister-in-law, Jean Wadoslavich, who was very close to him. And she only had intimations of the Boldereff thing, and Butterick himself until Tom Clark sort of broke it. Wasn't totally aware either of the importance of. Nobody was during Olson's life. It was.
How long did it go on?
Well, it was so sporadic. They met physically only about 4 times or something like that. And in one sense, he was pushing her off because he was at that time, he had a daughter, and then, of course, later a son with Betty. And he realized that the domesticity, which he valued, would be totally destroyed by Boldereff's power.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet he was fascinated and entranced. Yeah.
Yeah, so fascinating. She was a graphic designer, and she at one point developed a poster where of her soul and Olson's soul in kind of a communion or a sexual communion, and sent it to Olson. Well, Connie happened to be home that day, right? So then Olson had to communicate, like, well, this got me into a lot of trouble. And she writes back saying, the letter on the back of my poster represents one of the great spiritual achievements of this earth. Right? The note that she had affixed to the back of this poster was one of the great spiritual achievements.
Sounds like a bit of a stalker.
It's a complex and difficult kind of situation. Yeah. To have that sacred thing opened and vulgarly screamed about, so they had a big fight. Olson and Connie had a big fight about it. To be undefended by you, and then to be asked, I who prize honor deeper than life, to go by a back door, to let Connie slam the front door in my face, and then ask me, Charles, to enter by some back door, where I am a noble creature deserving honor. I have never been so wounded.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds like Dahlberg writing a book.
Well, actually, yeah, he's drawn to these domineering figures,
Well,
right?
sounds very Freudian.
Right? Yeah.
The house.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting that Olson gave me a copy of Hermes to his son Thoth, which I think is Boldareff's best book. But he didn't tell me at all anything about her. He just said this came. He had a couple of copies, I think she sent, because one's in stores, I believe. And he just said, this is more your field than mine, because of the Giordano Bruno, who was one of Boldareff's heroes, along with D.H. Lawrence, Rimbaud, and James Joyce.
Sure. Giordano Bruno?
Absolutely.
He's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
There's
me
a
too.
statue in
I have
Capo di
a
Fiore
lot of his
in
work
Rome.
in translation.
Yeah.
I know too that Boldareff was kind of ousted for her writing. There was some letter where she says to Olson about "Call me Ishmael," like it happened to me. They're not gonna respect you what you just did. I think it was her book on Whitman or something. But yeah, I think it's a good line. And she can really zing them out. I mean,
can.
it has something like, she says something like, oh, that reminds me of when I was in college. And something.
Sure, yeah. Okay, and let's close off Boldareff with some of what I consider to be the problematics of her positions and so on. She was steeped in Nietzsche. I think some of her positions might be categorized today as alt-right. Perhaps. So, she says, first, I want more than anything in the world to come off with a new and un-Hebraic notion of life. And the angle I want is so very un-Greek too. And then she talks about Joseph Strigowski, who was an art historian. Again, someone I consider problematic art historian, who, despite his Polish name, believed in a kind of pan-Germanism and thought he could divide kind of architecture and art history along these ethnic or racial lines. So for him, there was Gothic architecture, which was vigorous and northern or Nordic, and he felt like it came through an Indo-European kind of attitude, and then he also felt that there was a Mediterranean and, in quote, Hebraic architecture and art that for him was degenerate, for him was lesser than the Nordic. And so she grabs onto this. I mean, she really embraces it. She says, here is where Strigowski comes in. He proves that all that stuff around the Mediterranean architecture, fresco and mosaic with figures, is decadent, Greek and Hebraic, and that everything which made Gothic came from two sources only, your Scandinavian north, very north, and the triangle in Iran and Armenia, that the running fresco, the barrel vault, the dome, and Gothic use of the pilaster, etc., all originated in that intensely religious area, where Jesus, as I told you, was a man on a horse the whole time. So she has this odd depiction of Jesus or Christ. A man on a horse all the time. God, how I love that. What a new concept. How un-Hebraic. Christ, with that old Cossack discipline and the knees tight to guide a horse. So her sense of what a divine figure worthy of her adoration has to be a figure of command, dominance. It can't be a soft Christ. It has to be a Christ that rides a horse and has this, quote, Cossack discipline. So that's there. And Olson does bring in Strigowski kind of briefly in some of his poems, but it's not a major part of his thinking, but it's kind of there. So, let me see. And then we also need to talk about Waddell and I believe. I guess we're not going to really talk about the Gate in the Center, which was an essay Olson published with Origin magazine, but Waddell kind of haunts some of Olson's thinking with the erroneous etymologies of Sumerian linguistics, so which we think is the cradle of civilization, ancient Sumerian language, Gilgamesh, the great poem. We know that it's called a language isolate. It's not related to anything. And the texts of Gilgamesh survive through Akkadian, which is a Semitic culture. But Waddell believed this was all Aryan. He's like, civilization has to be Aryan in his imagination. And so he felt like Sumerian was an Aryan language. and that civilization somehow was dispersed through the Aryans traveling across the world. And so Olson's fixated on kind of the Bronze Age at a certain point, and you may come across that. And, well, the Bronze Age, I studied that kind of deeply when I was in school, but for Olson, the collapse of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age is kind of the collapse of an Aryan kind of civilization. And that comes across in several of these letters. But anyway, just in case you come across the Gate in the Center essay, that underwrites it all. But anyway, let's move on to projective verse and Brooks Adams, another
Nice.
figure that Olson read deeply, and because of Pound more, not really Boulder, but Pound. So we talk about projective verse, and we're going to do a deep study of projective verse right now.
So did projective verse come out in poetry?
Came out Poetry New York, not Poetry Magazine.
Okay.
There was a smaller magazine called Poetry New York.
Okay.
And I don't really read, I've never come across Poetry New York as a significant journal otherwise, besides that one essay.
It was edited by Tambamuto, this British, Anglo-British Indian poet, who was in Boston for a while. And I had that first thing, but when I met Olson, he told me not to bother with projective verse at all, but to read the Feinstein letter. The letter to Elaine Feinstein, which is published at the end of projective verse, but which is later, I guess, yeah. Because that's what he stood by then,
Yeah.
rather than the argument of projective verse.
Right, so projective verse was published in 1950, and it has such a small distribution. And it's only in 1960, 10 years later, that it's included in Donald Allen's Anthology of the New American Poetry, and that's when it really gains traction.
But
You know.
it certainly influenced William Carlos Williams. a great
Sure.
deal.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a small group. I say Robert Duncan read it before it appeared in 1960. Williams did. But in terms of its influence on younger, maybe college students who are then coming to poetry, in 1960 that had a big influence. But there is a small circle of people who are in the know, certainly in 1950, who are reading it.
I think Williams, the 50th chapter in his autobiography is called Projective Verse.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And it's fun. It's so good. You could read this every morning, I think. And you'd be on your way.
So the kind of the theoretical background of projective verse is partly to be found in Brooks Adams. So Brooks Adams was basically a materialist kind of historian, charting the rise and then the decline and fall of civilizations. As it was other materialist kind of historians at the time, some of you think of materialist philosophy, materialist economics, thinking that history is going to go in a certain direction, whether it's underwritten by Hegel or Marx, that there's an end point. But with Brooks Adams, it's this up and down, these kind of curves of consolidation, amassing of power, and then dissipation.
I should say that Olson was very influenced by Spengler, who is a cycle of history. We talked a lot about Spengler and Toynbee, as a matter of fact, much preferred. I suppose he read Spengler very early. I mean, it was published in English in the 20s.
Yeah.
The reason it was a bestseller, The Decline of the West.
Absolutely.
It's mistitled, really. It's English, yeah.
Right, that societies, Spengler's societies are kind of a superorganism that have a lifespan. Yeah. But with Brooks Adams, what I think is important about Brooks Adams is the issue of energy, which his brother Henry Adams is also kind of fixated on energy and entropy. So there's a preface to The Law of Civilization and Decay that I'll read, and then we'll jump into projective verse. That consolidation of commerce leads to dissipation of spiritual vigor and also material prospects and social decline more broadly. So, quote, starting from this fundamental proposition, the first deduction is that as human societies are forms of animal life, these societies must differ among themselves in energy, in proportion as nature has endowed them, more or less abundantly with energetic material. Thought is one of the manifestations of human energies. That's really important. Thought is one of the manifestations of human energy.
That's the imagination. That's.
And among the earlier and simpler phases of thought, two stand conspicuous: fear and greed. Fear, which by stimulating the imagination creates a belief in an invisible world and ultimately develops a priesthood. And greed, which dissipates energy in war and trade. Probably the velocity of the social movement of any community is proportionate to its energy and mass, and its centralization is proportionate to its velocity. Therefore, as human movement is accelerated, societies centralize. In the earlier stages of concentration, fear appears to be the channel through which energy finds the readiest outlet. Accordingly, in primitive and scattered communities, the imagination is vivid, the mental types produced are religious, military, artistic. As consolidation advances, fear yields to greed, and the economic organism tends to supersede the emotional and the martial. Whenever a race is so richly endowed with the energetic material that it does not expend all its energy in the daily struggle for life, the surplus must be stored in the shape of wealth. When the surplus energy has accumulated in such bulk as to preponderate over productive energy. Now we're back to the poem we read. Productive energy of going out and grabbing the thing versus the stored wealth of speculation and so forth. When the surplus energy has accumulated in such bulk as to preponderate over productive energy, it becomes the controlling social force. Thenceforward, capital is autocratic, and energy vents itself through those organisms best fitted to give expression to the power of capital. In this last stage of consolidation, the economic and perhaps the scientific intellect is propagated while the imagination fades, and the emotional, the martial, and the artistic types of manhood decay. Brooks Adams. So then we're finding Olson here has found another use, and kind of way, perhaps a more productive use of Turner's thesis by reimagining it here. I think with the help of Brooks Adams, that the real issue is that as societies consolidate and capital consolidates, only a kind of bureaucratic kind of class or a class that's fitted to serve this consolidated capital can kind of survive. And all these other ways of being a person, your imagination is undercut or squashed, really. And this all has to do with energies. And so that...
Sounds like today.
Right, so then we are with projective verse. And that's, you wonder, why is all this energy stuff? Where's all this energy coming from? You know, and so it's not just the biological energy. It doesn't operate only at that level, though it includes that level. But it's also a social energy that you draw from. When we go around the room, maybe you want to start with the beginning?
Okay. I like is this Ma's milk is in this, right? I'm pretty sure. I think it's somewhere in
Ma's milk?
Ma's milk. That's one of the best lines in this, where he says, or it could have been his thing on Shakespeare, but maybe I'll get to it. It's about, it's somewhere in here. No, somebody knows what I'm talking about with the Ma's milk thing. That you get your language from, like, the tip. Yeah. I love it. It's good. Okay, so verse now. And this was in his great movie. Verse now, 1950. If it is to go ahead, if it is to be of essential use, must, I take it, catch up, and put into itself certain laws and possibilities of the breath, of the breathing of the man who writes, as well as of his listenings. The revolution of the ear, 1910, the trochees heave, asks it of the younger poets.
Mm-hmm.
What's he talking about in the 1910, the revolution of the ear, 1910? Does anybody know?
Do you know?
I don't know.
No?
That's where he was born.
1910 is actually the year he was born. But I assume that there's some reference here to... I mean, wouldn't really Pound and Eliot are kind of too young to be effective in 1910?
Pound was still effective, but I'm not sure that Olson was referring to Pound.
What do you think he's referring to in 1910?
But actually, Pound's practice already of getting rid of the idea of the iamb
There you go.
was there.
there.
Iambic verse, and he uses the trochees.
Mm-hmm.
But,
What is that, the trochees?
It's a measure in traditional Greco-Roman verse and English, for that matter. When verse is measured by iambs, trochees, spondees, and anapaests, for example, are the traditional scansion of Greco-Roman Renaissance.
The iamb was like the metronome, I think Pan said.
Yeah,
Right?
and also Williams himself was talking about getting rid of the iamb.
Henry, do you want to do the next paragraph?
Sure. I want to do two things. First, try to show the projective or open verse, try to show what projective or open verse is, what it involves in its act of composition, how in distinction from non-projective it is accomplished. And two, suggest a few ideas about what stance towards reality brings such verse into being. What that stance does, both to the poet and to his reader. That stance involves, for example, a change beyond and larger than the technical, and may, as well, and may, the way things look, lead to a new poetics and to new concepts from which some sort of drama, say, or of epic, perhaps, may emerge.
So broadening what poetry can be beyond the short rhymed and metered lyric to bringing back epic poetry and dramatic poetry and so on. Or the epic in poems and the dramatic within poems. Paul, can you do the next, like, two? There's a short one and then a longer one.
Okay. First, some simplicities that a man learns if he works in open, or what can also be called composition by field, as opposed to inherited line, stanza, overall poem. What is the old base of the non-projective? 1. The kinetics of the thing. A poem is energy transferred from where the poet got it. He will have some several causations by way of the poem itself to, all the way over to, the reader. Okay? Then the poem itself must, at all points, be a high-energy construct and, at all points, an energy discharge. So, how is the poet to accomplish the same energy? How is he? What is the process by which a poet gets in, at all points, energy, at least, the equivalent of the energy which propelled him in the first place? Yet an energy which is peculiar to verse alone, and which will be, obviously, also different from the energy which the reader, because he is a third term, will take away.
You see, there's concern with maintaining a high level of energy and a fear of entropy, a fear of the dissipation of that energy. There's also a personal fear, but also a social fear. Garrett, you want to take us to the next one?
This is the problem which any poet who departs from closed form is specially confronted by. And it involves a whole series of new recognitions. From the moment he ventures into field composition, puts himself in the open, he can go by no track other than the one the poem underhand declares for itself. Thus, he has to behave and be instant by instant aware of some several forces just now beginning to be examined. It is much more, for example, this push than simply such a one as Pound put it, so wisely to get us started, the musical phrase, "Go by it, boys," rather than by the metronome.
Bring music, but a whole range of other kinds of music, not just the music of the da-dum, the iamb, but and we'll see later with poets like Stephen Jonas bringing in rhythms of jazz and so on, that this really goes in a lot of different directions. And if you do that.
2 is the principle, the law which presides conspicuously over such composition, and when obeyed is the reason why a projective poem can come into being. It is this: form is never more than an extension of content. Or, so it got phrased by one, R. Creeley, and it becomes absolute sense to me with this possible corollary that right form in any given poem is the only and exclusive possible extension of content underhand. There it is, brothers, sitting there for use.
Yes.
Nice.
You do the next one?
Now 3, the process of the thing, how the principle can be made so to shape the energies that the form is accomplished. And I think it can be boiled down to one statement, first pounded into my head by Edward Dahlberg. One perception must immediately and directly lead to a further perception. It means exactly what it says, is a matter of, at all points, even I should say, of our management of daily reality as of the daily work. Get on with it. Keep moving. Keep in speed. The nerves, their speed, the perceptions, theirs, the acts, the split-second acts, the whole business. Keep it moving as fast as you can, citizen. And if you also set up as a poet, use the process at all points. In any given poem, always, one perception must move instanter on another. So I'll just, there we are fast, there's the dogma, and its excuse, its usableness in practice, which gets us, it ought to get us inside the machinery, now 1950, of how projective verse is made.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's really great.
yeah. So, and there's more, but in a major way, that's the heart of the matter. Are those first two pages.
But I love the way, he capitalizes his real points,
Sure.
people who are listening, that one
It's-
perception must immediately and
Right.
directly lead to a further.
He's trying to enact the high.
Practicing what he's preaching. Right.
Right, keep it high energies. It's this fear of losing one's energies, and also the fear of any kind of structure that might constrict the energies. You know.
It's funny, I haven't read this in probably 35 or 40 years, and I'm just realizing how much effect it had on my life.
Wow, that's really
And the way that I think or write or act. And I mean, because reading these words now, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that exactly. But I haven't paid, I've been off on another trajectory, I guess. But,
Yeah, that's really neat.
You've published several books, haven't you, Paul?
a couple,
Couple?
a
Yeah.
long time ago.
Okay. Would you publish some more someday? Would you keep on writing? Come to Gloucester?
Gloucester, probably.
Okay.
Yeah. The Gloucester effect.
There's so much more to this essay, but we have 15 minutes left, so let's read a Maximus poem, and that would be it.
I want to just say, Joanne Kiger, she just passed away, but I read a really good interview with her, and she talks about the importance of this poem and how when she was reading this for the first time, how it was like alive. The text was like a living text. And so, sorry, okay. So I just wanted to say that because she just passed away, and I hadn't read projective verse when I read the interview, but he's talking about energy, and I think that's probably exactly what he wanted, and he achieved it. And this is the best. Yes, great. Can I read one of these off the top?
You want to read you can read, go up to, let's do the first, stanzas, right? Do that.
Okay, cool. Oh, I like this one.
This is
Okay.
the first one, right? This is one that opens up the whole series.
Yeah. And then maybe somebody can hop on, right after I do the first one, so then somebody can do one, and we can go fast and
Give it high energy.
instanter.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so
let's see, we get 3.
yeah, we'll just go pop over it,
Yeah, there's 6.
And I think the last, whoever gets the last 6, I mean, that's the good stuff right there. That's where
It's all.
it's all good.
So maybe we should go the other way.
Okay, so I'll start it off.
Give it a high energy construct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I, Maximus of Gloucester, to you, offshore, by islands hidden in the blood, jewels and miracles, I, Maximus, a metal hot from boiling water, tell you what is a lance, who obeys the figures of the present dance. Anybody?
The thing you're after may lie around the bend of the nest, second time slain. The bird, and there, strong thrust, the mast, flight. Oh, the bird, oh, Celix, oh, Anthony of Padua, sweep low.
Oh, bless the roofs, the old ones, the gentle steep ones, of whose ridge poles the gulls sit, from which they depart, and the flake racks of my city.
Love is form and cannot be without important substance. The weight, say 50 carats, each one of us, perforce our goldsmith's scale. Feather to feather added, and what is mineral, what is curling hair, the string you carry in your nervous beak, these make bulk, these in the end are the sum. O my lady of good voyage, in whose left arm rests no boy, but a carefully carved wood, a painted face, a schooner, a delicate mast as bowsprit for forwarding.
The under part is, though stemmed, uncertain, is as sex is, as monies are, facts to be dealt with as the sea is, the demand that they be played by, that they can only be, that they must be played by, said he coldly, the ear. By ear, he said. But that which matters, that which insists, that which will last, that, oh, my people, where shall you find it? How? Where shall you listen when all has become billboards, when all, even silence, is spray-gunned? When even our birds, my roofs, cannot be heard, when even you, when sound itself is neoned in, when on the hill over the water, where she who used to sing, when the water glowed, black gold, the tide, outward at evening, when bells came like boats over the oil slicks, milkweed hulls, and a man slumped, attentionless, against pink shingles, O sea city.
One loves only form, and form only comes into existence when the thing is born. Born of yourself, born of hay and cotton struts, of street pickings, wharfs, weeds you carry in, my bird, of a bone of a fish, of a straw or will of a color, of a bell of yourself torn.
Love is not easy, but how shall you know, New England, now that pejorocracy is here, how that streetcars, O Oregon, twitter in the afternoon, offend a black gold loin? How shall you strike, O swordsman, the blue-red back when last night your aim was music, 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 and not the cribbage game? O Gloucestermen, weave your birds and fingers new, your rooftops, clean shit upon racks, sunned on American braid, with others like you, such extricable surface as fawn and oral, satyr, lesbos, vase. Oh, kill, 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 kill those who advertise you out.
In the bowsprit, bird, the beak in, the bend is. In, goes in, the form, that which you make, what holds, which is the law of object, strut after strut, what you are, what you must be, what the force can throw up, can. Right now, herein after, erect the mast the tender mast. The nest I say to you, I, Maximus, say, under the hand, as I see it over the waters, from this place where I am, where I hear, can still hear. From where I carry you, a feather as though sharp I picked up in the afternoon delivered you, a jewel, it flashing more than a wing, than any old romantic thing, than memory, than place, than anything other than that which you carry, than that which is, call it a nest, around the head of, call it the next second, than that which you can do. Woo! Yeah, so. Wow. Any thoughts any of you have to share about reading the poem?
Well, there was a very popular song about this time, which one, I forget the singer, but all I want is having you and music, music, music. Yeah. Wow. But I can't remember, but that was a #1 on the radio hit parade for a while.
So he's likening life to building a nest, that collecting life
There's
experiences.
a lot going on, and he's smashing so much together into this.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Which a nest is.
Sure.
What is perjurocracy?
Rule of the worst, like the pejorative, right?
Yeah.
And
Rule
so
of the worst.
bureaucracy would be the rule
The
of,
least of evils.
Mm.
rule of worst. So the wrong people are in power, you're saying?
Yeah. Ooh.
And maybe the people are not in power. Each person isn't in power.
Yeah.
The wrong people are in power, but you're like, we're distracted away from the individual's power, weight, and energy.
We're disempowered.
That's what but I feel like he's giving, I mean, this is energy, and you get it, and it's like the next second, what are we gonna do in the next 15 minutes?
Yeah.
And the concern for advertising and
Yeah.
dominance of corporations, and
Yeah.
people can't think anymore because they're being, their eyes and their minds are
Right.
invaded by
Yeah.
it all.
And I mean, imagine Olson thinking about or seeing, like, I'm taking the T a lot now. The whole thing is into the iPhone. I mean, looking
Yeah,
into
yeah.
the iPhone. I don't even know what he would make of that. I mean, unreal.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like replacement
Opposite
of the
of
eye.
experience.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But
That's
he's-
totally.
He's thinking, I mean, he's writing this in Black Mountain, right?
Yeah.
So he's thinking about Gloucester,
Yeah.
you know,
From away.
yeah.
This was in what year?
1950 or something. Yeah, you've been at Black Mountain since 48. As kind of a part-time guy, and he really settles in around that time.
So 67 years ago. That's really far out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say too that I found Brattle Bookshop. We've brought up Boston a lot, so I mean you probably know that bookshop on West Street by Boston Common. I found the Maximus, that one, jargon there. I asked
really?
for it 3 times and it wasn't there. And I went back, boom. And because I thought, you have to be able to find John Wieners and Charles Olson in Boston because they're hard books to find. And I found it. I ended up in Boston Common, met 2 strangers, and not poetry people at all. We smoked a joint. I hand them Maximus, and they love it. I mean, like they're not like the woman
It's
said.
so great.
The woman said, she said, I haven't seen a book like this since elementary school. That's what she said. Like she hadn't looked at verse since elementary school. And so we sit on those green benches, and she read it so beautifully, just at random, and it meant something to them. So I just think you just brought up that year. I don't know how that book was published in 1960, and so in Boston Common 2017, it was on, and any person got it. I mean, they got it.
That's really sweet.
Thank you.
Thank
This
you.
is great.
Thank you, Dave. This is
Thank you.
great. Yes. Very wonderful.
Great scholar, great teacher.
It's so great to have you.
And what's your name again?
Gabe.
Gabe.